Hello everyone and welcome back. I think it's been a while since we took a look at the metagame. Well, the Pauper metagame, at least in the Pauper challenge, uh, is kind of weird, I think, because, well, affinity seems to getting lowered in the Pauper challenge in its presence because so basically the metagame seems to be shifting more to burn and madness burn and seems to be dropping a fair amount of affinity, the affinity's presence in the Pauper challenge, and instead of affinity we're getting more copies of Burst Metalcraft. So basically Burst Metalcraft is the new affinity, is more bit down and has the same kind of reach. They don't have 8 hook, but they still have Galvanic Blast and also Lightning Bolt, and they're still running makeshift munitions. So basically they have not they have a fair amount of creatures. They're not big, but they can be aggressive, and of course they can kill you with Galvanic Blast or makeshift munition. Also, the most played version of Burst Metalcraft is the Cool Daughter Birth one with Roll Defeasance, so people aren't also playing Burst Bully because they're doing the same honor. What is the correct name of that card? The +1/+1 to all creatures. Well, whatever. The honors of the pledge, I think. Effect with or what sort of white weenie style swarm deck with Roll Defeasance, but they have more interaction and they have more card advantage in form of experimental synthesizer, so they probably are better against fairies. And actually Boros, regardless of the version, has always been a really bad matchup for fairies, and the current Boros Metalcraft seems to be better against fairies, mostly because they are better positioned against a monarch deck, but they also have makeshift munitions, and makeshift munitions is really the best red card against fairies. Anyway, I wanted to talk first about Madness Board. I call it Madness Board, but maybe you know it better by Raktus Madness or Raktus Burn. On Goldfish they call it Raktus Burn, and I think that is important to notice that we are currently seeing two versions of Burn. One with Serum Blaze, no, well, Serum Blaze is probably played in both versions, but it's important to notice that the first one is playing 2 copies of Fire Blast and 4 copies of the Raktus Snow Dual Land. Science is both a swamp and a mountain, and Science is a mountain. You can sacrifice it with Fire Blast, while the second version is running more artifacts, since they have the Blood Token from Voldaren Epicure and Vampire's Kiss, because they want to play Galvanic Blast. So they're running the dual artifact lands and also Great Furnace and Bolt of Whispers. Why people are playing Raktus Burn over the mono red version? Well, in my opinion, Raktus Burn is just a meta choice. I mean, is way better compared to Red Burn against Furies, since it has a lot of cantripping spells in form of Fury Temper, Alms of the Vein, and of course Kitchen Imp. They can also run a fair amount of card advantage, mostly in form of Fatal Looting, and the blood tokens, but the important part about the card advantage of the deck, at least against a blue interactive deck such as Ferris, is the part about the Madness spell, because since they're able to have 8 burn spells with Madness and also Kitchen Imp, they're running a fairly huge amount of cantripping threats. So another important part of the Kitchen Imps and burn spells of this deck is that Ferris isn't really able to interact well with Spellstutter Sprite against 3 mana burn spells. If you know how the matchup Ferris versus Burn works, well, you know that Spellstutter Sprite against Mono Red Burn is probably the best spell, especially if you pair it with Perseer. So if your turn 1 is Perseer and they don't have a Serum Blades, or they don't want to waste a Lightning Bolt on Perseer, on turn 2, unless they're blasting your Spellstutter Sprite with another burn spells, you are able, obviously, to counter a 2 mana spell, and that's truly important, I think. Well, not mainly being able to counter a 2 mana spell, but being able to counter a 1 mana spell each time you play a Spellstutter Sprite is truly great against Burn, because Burn, in Pauper at least, has always been a deck relying on the critical amount of cards in hand. So this deck is slower compared to the Red version, because it usually win on turn 6 instead of turn 4 or turn 5, but it has a lot of more card advantage in form of the Madness spell, and for that reason it has a better late game. Also, if you draw too many lands, you can just discard them with the blood token or with Pitiless Looting, and that's another important part. They also run Gurmag Angler in a singleton copy. Okay, seems fine to me. I mean, Gurmag Angler I think is kind of good, but having only one copy, I think that you don't really need to rely too much on it. Well, some lists probably are running the second copy of Gurmag Angler, which is cool and probably better, but I think most lists are playing only one copy. Anyway, since we talked about the metagame and we talked about Raktus Burn, I think it is important to notice how Raktus Burn is mostly played, because people started playing faster decks in the challenge. They started playing Red Burn, Red Heroic, and also they play a lot of Ferris. If you summarize the Dimir version and the Izzet variant, is the most played deck. Also, Boros Metacraft can be considered not very well positioned against Burn, because they don't really play any more Prismatic Strands, and also Prismatic Strands doesn't really do a lot against burn spells such as Bump in the Night or Helms of the Vein. So unless you draw your Long Missionaries, usually you don't really are able to get life gain. Yeah, you're playing Seeker of the Way, but if you are not able to protect your Seeker of the Way with cards like Prismatic Strands, for example, you are still weak to a well-placed Lightning Bolt on your Seeker of the Way. And for that reason, I think that most times Seeker of the Way isn't enough in Boros Metacraft if you face Burn. Anyway, Raktus Burn seems to be a fine choice for the current metagame. But I don't really think that the current version of Raktus Burn regardless of it playing Galvanic Blast or playing a Fire Blast, is tuned because they're still playing a couple of weird choices. For example, first pick Gargantua, or cards like the Edicts or Duress. I mean, okay, you can play Charged Edict or the Diabolic Edict to interact better with decks, for example, Buggles, since you usually die from a lifelink effect from Buggles. But why are you playing Molten Rain or Vespiar Gargantua? I mean, okay, Tron was kind of played for a while, but anyway, I don't really see any decent deck against you want to side in Molten Rain. And also, in which matchups are you siding in First Figure into? Because I guess you don't want to hardcast it with only 19 lands. I think most times you want to discard it with looting, so it's just a pay free to draw one card and deal 5 damage. So you are bringing First Figure Gargantua against which deck? I guess non-interactive decks. But I think the most represented non-interactive deck in the challenge are Burn, so losing one life from your First Figure to a ETB doesn't seem very great. Another card that I find truly great in this version of Burn is Fooder Tosser. In my opinion, it will be better to run 2 or even 3 copies of Fooder Tosser, because having a free discard outlet, because it doesn't cost mana to activate Fooder Tosser, and an extra damage source, in my opinion, is great. Anyway, you can just discard it with looting, the blood token, or even another copy of Fooder Tosser. Each card you are discarding, each dead card you have in hand, can be extra damage with Fooder Tosser. And when you're playing Burn, from my point of view, seems just great. The metagame also seems kind of weird from my opinion, because, well, we talked enough about Affinity getting something like a disappearance in the challenge presence, but also the Saturday challenge got really weird, because Azer's Familiar was the most played deck, and in my opinion, as I recall, that's the first time in a while, or the first time ever, that Familiars was the most played decks. Current days Familiar, anyway, isn't anymore a combo deck. It's more like a control deck. You can consider it basically a Jeskai Ephemeral deck without Cleansing Welfare and any other red card. So basically the interaction relies mostly on Snap and also the counter spells. Your card advantage, your lock spell most times is Ephemerate. You are still running 1 or 2 copies of Ghost of Flicker, most times 2 copies of Ghost of Flicker and 2 copies of Ephemerate, because if you have 2 copies of Familiar, 1 Archimancer and 1 Flicker, you have an infinite combo. By blinking your Archimancer and 1 Island, you get infinite ATBs, and with infinite ATBs, you are able to get infinite lives with Faithful, or you are able to mill your opponent with Sage Roll Denies. Okay, the proper finisher of this deck can be considered Sage Roll Denizing, but most times you aren't winning by milling your opponent with Sage Roll Denizing. Most times you are winning because you, as a control deck, your opponent doesn't really have enough resources, so basically you force your opponent to spend or to waste all their resources till they don't have any cards or creatures left in hand or on the battlefield, and then you just win throughout combo step with Muldrifter, Arcomancer, or Sigiter. Snap can also be considered a part of one of the parts of the combos of this deck, because if you have something like 2 Arcomancer and at least 1 copy of Sunscape Familiar on the battlefield, you are able to play an infinite amount of Snap and bounce all your opponent's creatures, because, well, you also need 1 or 2 copies of the Azur's Bouncer and Azur's Caster to get enough mana, unless you have 2 copies of Sunscape Familiar on the battlefield. You play, basically you blink with Ghostly Flicker your 2 copies of Archaeomancer and bring back your Snap and play it repetitively and just bounce every creature of your opponent, since Snap doesn't cost mana. Instead, it generates at least 1 blue extra mana when you have another Sunscape Familiar on the battlefield. So if you have at least 1 Familiar and 1 Bouncer, you just pay 1 mana for Snap and 2 mana for to cast Ghostly Flicker, and without paying any mana, basically bounce all your opponent's creatures. And that's basically the way you interact with aggressive decks in a late game by neutralizing all their changes to win throughout combo step. I think it is important to notice that Familiars as a ephemerate deck is also better when it comes to casting at Dust to Dust, since white is the secondary color. It has a better mana base when it just comes to cast Dust to Dust. They often maybe also run extra copies of Dust to Dust in form of Revoke Existence, but I recommend you, if you want to win against Burrows or against Affinity through Dust to Dust, I recommend you to play something like 6 copies of Dust to Dust effect, because the Punza or the Land Denial gameplay against the Metalcraft deck usually is worth if you are playing an ephemeral deck, if you have enough copies of Land Denial of Land Dust to Dust, which means that you need to cast at least 2 copies of Dust to Dust, or at least 1 Dust to Dust and 1 Revoke Existence in early game to be able to have a high chance, or a high chance enough to win against them without relying too much on ephemerate. From my personal experience, I always found ephemerate as a better win condition against any Affinity or Metalcraft deck, because it is more flexible and you usually still go to the late game unless you have double Dust to Dust in early game, and ephemerate is, with ephemerate you are able to cast multiple copies of Dust to Dust in your game, and you are also able to get back all your Hydroblast, Last Breath, snaps, counterspell, etc. I think also that's important to notice that they are also able to run Stormhorn Dignitary, and Stormhorn Dignitary is still, in my opinion, the best way to interact against Swarm decks in Pauper. If you are playing against Boggles, Elves, Wolf's Cascade, Stompy, and also decks like Boros Metalcraft, Dignitary seems good enough for me. I will not bring in Dignitary against Affinity, since Dust to Dust is better alongside Snap to interact with their threats, and their main threats of Affinity are Mirror Enforcer and Gurmagam. You can also see that the Familiars decklist that got the first and the second place in the challenge were running Modern Age, which is a great way to deal with fairies. It's basically draw 2, discard 2 with 2 free flying creature, which is great against a fairies because you get to dig more in your deck trying to find both lands or draw spells. But I think that's the most important part, is that you are running more problematic creatures for them, and usually fairies is able to win against familiars if familiars is not able to get to the late game, because ephemerate is the same thing as monarch but is better usually. And if you have familiar is also running a lot of blockers in form of Sunscape Familiar, Godspurs, Petals, Sigurd Oracle, and Moondrifter, and in my opinion having extra bodies to just block their ninjas and also their fairies, since Moondrifter is the only flying creature if you're not playing Vector Leader or the Modern Age. Is kind of important because sometimes they can also kill you by attacking you with a flying creature. In my opinion, Familiars is still a great deck, but the most broken part of Familiar is Ephemerate, and for that reason I think that it's better to playing 3 copies of Ephemerate instead of only 2 copies. Deck seems still good and also seems still well positioned against a lot of the decks in the metagame, so I can recommend it to you if you are not worried by Magical Line, Swiss Chess Clock, or have to draw some matches in your local game store. Jeskai seems better in Paper Magics only because you are running Galvanic Blast or Lightning Bolt, and ephemerate your commander to bring back Galvanic Blast or Lightning Bolt seems a faster way to win most times. I think that the current Pauper metagame is good, especially in tabletop Magic, since on tabletop most players are playing to just have fun, or first to have fun, especially when I play in my LGS, a local game store. Most times people just play to have fun, and they play a large variety of decks. Also decks that are not shown on Magical Line. In example, Jand with Cleansing Warfare, Boarding Party, and Annoyed Artichoke, or Mono Black Zombie, for example. Instead of the Pauper metagame, the challenge metagame seems to be more focused right now on having fast matches, but I think that the reason mostly is due to the presence of a large amount of event on Magical Line, not only Pauper but also of the other formats, and that's important I think because most people playing on the challenge, regardless of the format, are grinders, and they're trying to get qualifier points, and treasure chest is important because we are having more competitive events on Magical Line, and grinding qualifier points could be relevant because you need those qualifier points to try to participate in the various major events that requires qualifier points to participate in. Well, most times you don't really need qualifier points to participate in them, but it's important to notice that if you're able to use your qualifier points instead of play points or event tickets, well, that's better because you don't need in any other way your qualifier points. So that means you have higher chances to get a qualification for a MOX, or just to get to the top 32 or top 64. So that means you are getting free treasure chests. That is great, because treasure chests are basically free money, especially when you are able to sell your event tickets to some bots or to other players. And for example, thanks to the treasure chest, I were able, since I started on playing on Magic Online, to play a large variety of formats in decks, and I was also able to get a lot of money. Probably not that many, but enough to pay my electricity bills, or so I think that's important to notice that. And is that I think a scene of Magic Online metagame is shaped by the quality of players that are playing it. Well, guys, thank you for watching this video. I'll try eventually to put a schedule on my Twitch account, because I think that will be kind of important for my chances to get more visualization or more followers on YouTube, to get to just try to be more constant on my Twitch. So probably I'll start streaming on Central European time, probably 2021, so 9 p.m. on Tuesday and probably Thursday. So see you next week with some Twitch and eventually some re-upload from Twitch.